Hi, my name is Steven Rubin. I am the author of The Unraveling of Michael Galler, and welcome to One Final Twist.
I'm thrilled to welcome you, number one, because this is your debut, correct?
Correct.
And I'm a sucker for a debut. This will always stand out. And number two, this book is going to run in the top books for me for 2026. I don't know if anybody can knock me out of my seat better than this book. So before we get started, kind of tell everybody about the book.
So, this is the story of Michael Galler. He is a teenager who is transitioning from high school to college. And through a series of events during his youth, he has come to obtain an obsessive fear of getting cancer. And his understanding of what cancer is very different than what you and I might think of it as simply malignant cellular growth. For him, it's any type of illness or disease that kind of lurks and grows secretly within us over time. And he tries his best to fortify his own body because he thinks that cancer is coming after him and after his family. And he comes to these conclusions based on these events that take place in his life. And so as he fortifies himself to be able to make sure that he can protect himself and fend it off if and when it ever materializes to him, he sets as his primary objective the Boston Marathon. And he believes that if he can complete that distance successfully, that will be a strong signal to him that his body is strong enough. Meanwhile, as he makes this transition, he comes to meet a woman who's just a few years older than he is, and he strikes up a very complex emotional relationship with this woman. And so while he is training diligently for the marathon and the miles are starting to accumulate and wear him down a bit physically, this relationship tests him emotionally to a point where kind of everything comes together.
Okay, so my first question is, Michael is a marathon runner and you are a marathon runner. And so I see the connection there, and it was both the Boston Marathon. What was the original nugget for this? And I kind of want to talk about like how he's trying to outrun something, and then like the therapy and running. My family are runners too. So like I see that too. So I know it's kind of like a three-part question, but like the original nugget, the connection to the marathon and outrunning things.
So let me start with the nugget of where the idea came from. And I think it would have meant nothing if I hadn't already decided that I wanted to write a book. And I was trying to siphon through some ideas, and none of them were really resonating with me until one day I was dealing with a very challenging situation. And I remember thinking to myself, kind of in a metaphorical way, that this situation is like a cancer. It was slow build, and it kind of took me by surprise. And I said to myself, this is like a cancer. And my immediate next thought was, well, what if it really was cancer? But not cancer in the way that I knew it to be, but in a way where cancer was some form of an insidious force that could present itself in different forms that it thought was the most appropriate form to take down its target, if you will. And because I was already had the idea of writing a book, I immediately pulled out a piece of paper, started writing notes as to kind of how I could make this story come to life. Sorry, there was more parts to that question.
I know. I am like that. I'm sorry. I have so many things to unpack with it. When you called it, when you said you knew I had a lot, I do have a lot to unpack with this book.
Sure. So I would never consider myself a marathon runner. I tell people that I'm not a marathon runner. I'm not a runner. I actually hate running a lot. But I have run 3 marathons, and each one I think is its own individual story. In high school, I was a sprinter. I ran the 50-yard dash and indoor track, but primarily I played football in high school and transitioned that to college. And I played college football at the University of Pennsylvania as a running back. So I was always a sprinter. And as I thought through how to make this idea work, I had to reverse engineer Michael in my mind. I had to create a person who could come to think that cancer was something different than what most of us believe. And so I took a number of different events that were in my life that were completely unconnected. And I thought to myself, well, if I connected these, and maybe these were all different forms of what I'm now defining on behalf of Michael Galler as the author, different forms of cancer, how can I get Michael to believe that they are indeed different forms of cancer that are after him? And from there, I had to create an environment in which Michael was going to protect himself. And as much as I tried to make the sport of football be that crucible, it just really didn't work. But that was what I knew. So I was trying to write what I knew, if you will. And I had run the New York Marathon in 1994 really as just a bucket list item and had vowed never to run another marathon again. That's how challenging it was. But interestingly, the 100th Boston Marathon was the very next year. And I'm from Boston, born and raised, and that was going to be the biggest party in Boston. It was very difficult to get a number to enter that race. I was fortunate enough to obtain a number, not through qualifying, but through raising money for charity, and ended up running a second marathon and vowed again to never do it again. There was a third marathon in my future, probably 20 years after that, where I just wanted to get back in shape because I just didn't like the way I felt. So I trained for the Marine Corps marathon this time and ended up having a heart attack halfway through the marathon. I was at mile 16 and my family was running out to me with nutrition and nourishment. And fortunately, there was a medical tent right there. And I said, no, I think I need to go into this medical tent. So I never fell to the ground, with people standing over me with paddles yelling clear, but they called an ambulance. They brought me to the hospital. But I didn't want to be defined as a person who ran a marathon and had a heart attack. I wanted to be defined as a person who went back and finished it. So 5 years later, with approval from my doctor and my wife, of course, I went back, I retrained from the very beginning, and I reran the Marine Corps marathon and completed it. And it's through all of these marathon ordeals that I realized that it was the perfect kind of litmus test for Michael because it was a sign of endurance. It took training, it took commitment, it took deliberation. It took all the things that might also define the enemy that was after him.
So Tremont comes in here. Okay, let me just say how I read this book. I read this book and I have no idea how long I stayed at it until I realized I was there. I don't know how to explain what I'm saying. I lost the time. I was so into it because I was like, where are these two? So you have the two storylines. I know they're going to cross. When are they going to cross? What is happening? Michael's running away from this stuff. Then you've got Tremont over here on the other side who's really he's also trying to outrun something too. So you've got Michael trying to outrun cancer or all bad things, like whatever is going to take his happy away. Then you've got Tremont and he's trying to outrun his like the way he's been raised and the things that he's seen and been exposed to. And I know in my heart they're going to connect. And I am probably 3/4 of the way through the book going, I still have no idea what is happening. I am so into this. Holy smokes, what is going to happen? Are you having readers come to you and saying that that they got lost? I was in for the whole time.
Sure. I've had readers come to me saying, I know something is happening. I know something is building. I can feel it, but I just don't know what it is until, of course, it eventually comes. Tremont was an interesting character for me because he plays an important role more towards the end of the story. And as I had started writing, it occurred to me that I could not just introduce him at the end because that would be too contrived. So I realized I had to write Tremont's story. And although I knew exactly what Michael's story was from beginning to end and was writing very linearly from that beginning to that end, I really didn't have a story for Tremont. I only had a role for Tremont. So when I started writing him, I decided to make him Michael's foil. And so I introduced him at the age, I think he's like 13 or 14, which is how old Michael was at the time in the story where Tremont comes in. And I really had no story arc for him. I only had an idea of who I wanted him to be and who I wanted him to become. So as I continued to write about Michael's story, I would occasionally drop out and just kind of ask myself, well, let's see what Tremont's up to. And I would write this chapter about Tremont. And if you put all the pieces of Tremont together, I think it does create a story arc for him. Almost, I probably could have written a book just about Tremont, but he was a very interesting character because his life, he's raised very differently than Michael. Michael's raised in a very loving environment in the suburbs of Boston. Tremont is raised in a very abusive situation in the city. And all the things that Michael has, Tremont does not. And I think you had captured him perfectly. I had read one of your comments somewhere where you had said he's so desperate to get out of a situation that he's willing to destroy himself in order to do it. And I don't think I could have described it any better if I had tried. So I thank you for helping me really understand exactly what he was doing. I had other plans for him, not realizing that the reader is actually becoming vested in him as a person.
Well, they're both forced to be in very uncomfortable situations, and they both want to get out of the situation, just in different lanes. Like they're going to get there. They both want to change their situations. And okay, emotionally speaking, how hard was it to write both of these characters? Because nothing really good is happening in either character's life. I mean, and it's different battles, but they're both hard battles.
Yeah, so I'll talk about Tremont first. Tremont is in a very difficult situation. And if you reflect back on each one of his chapters, it's really not about his situation, but each one of these chapters he's presented with a problem or a situation that he has to solve. Or in some cases, he doesn't solve it, but he at least comes to an understanding of what kind of a person he is and how that chapter might have ended. It just happens to be in this ugly soup of his environment that all of this takes place. For Michael, remember, I know Michael's story from beginning to end. And because it's so linear, and I'm telling it linearly, I'm following right along with him. And so as each one of these emotional scenarios materialize for Michael, I'm right there with him and I'm feeling it with him. And I'm trying to write the weight of the WEIGHT, write the weight that he's feeling in each one of these situations. And it just keeps building. And I'm highly focused on getting to a point 3/4, maybe 2/3 of the way into the story where Michael comes to this ultimate traumatic realization that his worst fears have come true. And of course, there wouldn't be a book if his worst fears didn't come true. And that's where I was headed. And I was just so focused on, can I pull this story off? That was what I was really worried about. I think I was more worried than Michael was, because the plot was so complicated, even though maybe it felt simple because it was linear, but it was complicated to put all the people in the right places for it to work. especially to get to that point 2/3 of the way in the book.
When the ending, well, I'm just going to say, this was that moment when I said, oh my God, no, that is not where this is going. Like, I didn't see any of it coming, how it was all going to tie together. No, I had no idea. I think I was so absolute. I just can't express to you how much time I don't want to say lost, but I was lost in the book. I was so into this book. I mean, the day just disappeared, and I was in. I mean, I really was invested in the characters to see where they were going to go, and then the ending just said, it just come up and bit me on the tail. Like, what just happened here?
Yeah, that's the reaction I get the most is
Yeah.
the ending. Some people call it a twist. I think it's more just the inevitable reveal of where this story only could have gone.
Yeah.
Was there ever a place writing the story that it became unexpectedly personal?
No, because all the characters were fictional. I will say that chapter 1 is probably the most personal because, as I told you, I had drawn from my own life and connected a lot of pieces. And so that chapter 1 is essentially how I remember that event happening in my life. And a lot of people will read, the people who know me intimately, they'll read the first 3 or 4 chapters and they'll say, is this book about you? And I say, no, it's absolutely not about me. But I see why you might recognize me a little bit at the beginning because that's where I'm drawing from. But Michael Galler and I are in no way alike. And our
Another
paths take
big,
very different courses.
yeah. So another big theme that I noticed in here too was loneliness. So they're and it's for Michael and for Tremont. They don't really, even when Michael becomes involved with someone else, he keeps a lot of his things close to his chest. I mean, he doesn't really express himself. He really doesn't. Was loneliness like your intended outcome? Did you when you started, did you think that the readers would come away with that too?
No, I wouldn't say that was intended, but one of the things that was intended was in order for cancer to have its effect, it has to get inside you. And it grows secretly, silently, deliberately inside you until eventually you're diagnosed. And because Michael has this different awareness of this threat that lives inside you, it's very difficult for him to open up. And that was a quality that I did deliberately write into Michael, that opening up emotionally is very difficult. And that's why Julie is such a challenge for him, because in a relationship like that, she's trying very much to advance the relationship. And in order for relationships to go forward, people have to open up to each other. And if that created a sense of loneliness, I won't say it was intentional, but one thing that I'm well aware of is that training for a marathon and running a marathon is a very lonely experience. And in the chapter where Michael eventually gets to the starting line of the marathon, I tried my best to express how somebody can feel so alone, surrounded by 30,000 other people doing the same thing that he is. And there really is a true loneliness with that. So for all you marathon runners out there, I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you are a first-time marathon runner, I'm sure you're experiencing it as well.
I don't think people understand how even like we did try to do a half marathon and with my girls, and we actually didn't end up doing it, but we worked really hard to get there. And even just that half marathon, it's a game in your head, it's a game against your body. You're fighting so many things, and for me it makes sense for Michael to have put his body to the test in this book, because it's a mental battle, and there's just a lot of pieces to that puzzle that people don't understand.
Yeah, I would say that if you ever go to a marathon and you're watching the runners go by, each one of them has something in their head, some demon that they're fighting to get from the beginning to the end of that absurd distance of 26.2 miles. And for some people, that could be 4 hours, it could be 5 hours, and for some people longer.
So, how many of your readers are saying they just can't stand Julie now that this is?
A lot of people don't really talk about Julie. Julie, of course, is the woman that Michael strikes up a relationship with, and it's an incredibly emotionally complex relationship. She is challenging him in some very intimate ways that were certainly a challenge to write. And her character was probably the most difficult one to write out of all of them. And I struggled the most. I think her character evolved in a lot of different ways. I kept trying to inject pieces of other relationships that I had been in and tried to inject them into her character, and it failed at every time because Julie was not any other person that I had ever met. She was somebody that I had created on the page. And the more I wrote about her, the more enamored I became with this relationship and the impact it was having on Michael.
And she's, I mean, she is, Julie ends up, I think she ends up being selfish, like, and but she does it, it's not like it's sneaky. I mean, she says in the,
How tell us about your process of writing in the mindset of teenager slash young adult. How did you do that?
So I'll answer it specifically. I'll tie it back to Julie. First of all, I selected a teenager, and at that age of transition, because I think that's when people they've just become adults, but they're incredibly immature adults, and so they are very vulnerable at that age to a lot of different anxieties and other things. And given what I knew of the plot and the story, I thought that was the best age to accomplish what I wanted to accomplish. Julie needed to be a little bit older because she's a little bit more mature, and she's the one who's driving the relationship, not Michael. And the biggest challenge for me was how to build that relationship to such an emotional peak, and to do it with somebody at that immature age. And I finally came up with a path that I think worked pretty well. And I kind of envisioned, how might a teenager or somebody Michael's age approach a relationship? And to be quite sophomoric about it, we might think in terms of getting to first base, getting to second base, and getting home. And there are 3 successive chapters between Michael and Julie in which he advances on the base paths, if you will. But there is so much more going on in those chapters, both emotionally, strategically, and tactically, that I think you might not have noticed that was the kind of format that I took to build that relationship to its ultimate crescendo.
She was nurturing too. I felt like that was part of the draw to her. She was filling a hole for him.
Yeah, so Michael loses his mother to cancer, which is the inciting incident of this whole story. And he's raised by his widowed father, and he has a younger brother who he feels compelled to protect against this kind of evil, nefarious thing that he envisions cancer to be. And so Michael is busy protecting himself. He's protecting his father. He's protecting his brother. He's trying to protect everybody, but he doesn't have that matriarchal influence in his life. And that's the hole and the void that Julie is filling.
Yeah, that part of those little pieces where, she was taking care of even his dad, and she would make supper, and she cared for the brother. Like she really did fill a big hole in that entire family's life.
Yeah, and there is a scene, it was actually a breakfast where they're all together in the same room, and you can see to the degree that Julie has kind of instilled herself into the family, and you can see the reaction from each and every one of the family members, and they are all kind of viewing Julie very differently through very different lenses.
When you set out to do this book, it's a slow psychological slow burn. I mean, it really builds the tension. Was that your intent on the at the beginning, or is that just something that kind of happened?
So I came up with the idea first, and then I had to figure out how to make the idea work. And I wrote the first chapter, what was then the first chapter. And I gave it to a friend of mine. I said, can you read this and just tell me what you think? And he read it, and where I had started the story was probably somewhere at closer to that 2/3 mark that I talked about earlier. And he read it and he's like, well, this happened and that happened and this happened. It's like, there's a lot going on in this chapter. And he asked me, what is the inciting incident? And I'd never heard that phrase before. And I'm embarrassed to say that because how can you write a novel without having an inciting incident? But what he pointed out to me was that I didn't have one. And what had happened was I had started the book in the wrong place. So that is what made me realize I need to start this story at the beginning and then work slowly to get to that point at the 2/3 mark where Michael has the epiphany or the realization that his fears are coming true. And so that was a slow burn because I think that was really the only way that I could write it. I wouldn't say I set out to write a slow burn novel, but this story I think only could have worked that way. Yeah. And I kept going back to Tremont because his scenes are always filled with action. So I thought, okay, if the reader is getting a little bit too emotionally involved here, and maybe I need something to push the story forward, I would just, like I said, I'd go back to say, let's see what Tremont's up to right now. And there's always some very visceral action in Tremont's chapters.
Of course, you said you knew from the beginning the end of the story. Did you, when you wrote the book, did you plot it out, or did you just start going and just write, and then go back and edit and write? Were you a plotter or a pantser?
So I'm absolutely not a pantser. I don't know if plotter might be a little bit too aggressive. I would say I'm a very intentional writer, and I cannot write the next sentence until I know the one I wrote is exactly the way it needs to be. I can't go to the next paragraph until the paragraph I wrote made the point that I wanted to make, and I cannot go to the next chapter until the one I just wrote is finished. So when I finished the book, when I got to the end of the book was finished. Now, of course, it did have to go through a copy edit phase and a proofread phase, but the book was completely written. Now, there were chapters I knew that I had to write that I didn't know what they were going to be. For example, to Teresa's point, I knew that Tremont and Michael had to meet, but I had no idea what that scene was going to look like until it eventually came to me. I knew that Michael had to meet Julie, but I didn't know what that was going to look like. I knew that there are other things that I knew were going to happen, and I might have marked a chapter, with a title, Michael meets Julie, Michael meets Tremont, but I didn't plot out exactly what those chapters would look like until I got
I had read somewhere, and I don't know if I had just researched your name, but it's been a hot minute because as soon as I knew you were debut, I'm going to get in there. That this book, you started it a while back and then put it down and picked it back up, right? Am I?
So I probably, I don't know how long it took me to write the book, but if you told me it was 15 to 20 years, it wouldn't surprise me. Now, that's not me writing every day or every week for that many years. You're living your life. I have a career outside of writing. I have a family. I raised 3 children. And so it's fine. I could go months without writing, and that's why it took so long. But when I started it way back, I think in 1996, maybe 1997, when I wrote the first Tremont chapter, I was kind of so surprised at how well it had turned out that it really worked. To me, it could have worked as just a short story on its own. And so I was living up near Marblehead, Massachusetts at the time, and I submitted that chapter to the Marblehead Festival of Arts in the literary component, and I won Best in Show for short fiction.
Oh,
And when they found out that I finally published the book just recently, they invited me back to speak for an hour. And so I'm going back this July 4th holiday. If you're in and around Marblehead, Massachusetts on July 2nd, which is Thursday, I'm going to speak for an hour about that journey from when I started the book to when I finished it and published it.
that's awesome.
Has your writing style changed, or have you just grown as a person over the last 25, 30 years?
I hope I did grow as a person over all that time. But my writing style has always been very deliberate. If I'm writing an email, I'm not the kind of person that just, fires off something. I choose my words carefully when I write. And I think that's reflected in Michael's character. I think it's reflected in the dialogue in the book. I always knew that the final scene was going to be a verbal confrontation. And I was very worried about how I was going to achieve that. But I just kept marching on. I kept writing and writing, knowing and dreading that this chapter was coming, not even knowing how it was going to play out. And when I got there, I just very carefully put the characters in place and just very carefully moved the conversation forward until I got the outcome that I was looking for.
You talked about being a deliberate writer and perfecting the chapter, the paragraph before. About how long did it take to get your book edited? That people ask, about how long do you think it took since you thought you were
Sure.
good to go?
When I submitted it to the publisher, Spark Press, they liked what they saw. They wanted to move forward with it. But before I signed a contract, I knew the book was finished. I knew it was as good as it was going to get because I had been reading and editing it for 15, 20 years, maybe even longer, because it didn't get published when I finished it. I probably sat on it for another 10 years or so, trying to get it published. And before I signed the contract, I knew I should have a copy editor look at it. So I had a copy editor look at it, made a lot of great edits. And I think that process went really quickly in my mind. It might have been 2 months, 3 at the most, of just back and forth. And then it was ready to go. And then there was a final proofread by the publisher, but I don't really count that as part of the editing process of the story.
Working with the PR side of Spark Press, the book Spark, what was that experience like? Because that's how I was introduced to you, was through their program. Because I probably would not have, it would not have been on my radar without Book Sparks putting it in my inbox.
Well, I'm glad they did. I'm a consultant by trade. I work with large employers and helping them design their employee benefit strategies. And I, because I'm a consultant, I realized that I'm now in the opposite role where I'm the client and Book Sparks is my consultant. And the one thing I always have in my mind when I'm consulting to my clients is, if they follow the guidance that I'm sharing with them, and I'm of course backing it up with data and other metrics to document why these are good ideas. I had to be in the role of client, and I had to trust them that the things that they were doing and the approaches that they had were going to work for me as well. So I think the answer is a lot more simple. I just put my trust in them to do what I hired them to do. And that brought me here.
What's next for you?
I've started another novel. I have probably 3 or 4 other ideas. I would say that they're all very different. This particular one, When my daughter was 5, 6, 7 years old, of course, I read to her at night, but I also would make up stories as well, just 5 minute, crazy, silly stories. And one day I decided, well, let me try to just create a story that I would continue over time for 1, 2, 3 months, however long it took. And when I got to the end of it, I remember thinking, well, that was pretty good. There were some pretty good ideas in there, some pretty good themes. And then I just took a whole bunch of notes and put them away. And once I published this book, which came out just this past May, I immediately started taking out my notes and I started writing this story. And it's a story about a father and his daughter, of course, and the really difficult challenges of letting go. I hope it retains the same kind of emotion, but it's not going to have the kind of darkness and solitude that the Unraveling of Michael Galler has.
I'll need to read it because I'm sure it's going to rank me because I'm just now feeling the empty nesting situation. My youngest one moved out. What are we? Maybe 4 weeks ago, and so like they're all out of college. They're all moved out. They all have jobs. They've got houses. And then there's me. Letting go really is terrible. It is not fun.
Don't let her fool you. She is the busiest woman I have ever been associated with. She doesn't stop.
No.
Just circling back to the copy editing question, my copy editor provided a lot of great edits with Michael and Tremont, which really told me she understood each one of those characters, which made me feel really, really good. But one day she came back to me and she says, I really don't know how to edit Julie. I thought about that and I took it as a compliment. It meant that I created somebody that was so challenging to interpret and decipher and understand that even my copy editor couldn't recommend an edit or a change because she just didn't know what to change. And that told me that I really achieved in her what I wanted to achieve.
Yeah.
Were there any parts that you had to fight for that you said, no, this isn't coming out?
The title. But as for the book, no. There is one chapter with Tremont that I think is pretty visceral that I thought would get people's attention, but nobody in this process from beginning to end has even brought up that chapter. I'll just say Michael lives in a pretty violent atmosphere and this is a pretty violent scene. But what I remember when I wrote it, this is a really interesting part. It took me 15 to 20 years to write the whole book. I wrote that chapter in 3 hours and didn't really do much editing after it was finished. And I remember while I was writing it, I just had this feeling that it was getting out of control. And I kept thinking, I've got to stop this. I've got to kind of cut it off. But by that, I didn't mean stop writing it. I meant I need to have something change within the scene. But I was just so caught up in the whole moment in the scene that I couldn't stop it. I just had to keep writing it and finishing it. And I was glad I did. I was shocked that came out of me. It came out of my mind that I wrote it. But what followed was just such a perfect cathartic moment for Tremont that helped propel him into his next part of the story. But nobody's mentioned it.
What advice would you give now that you're a traditionally published debut author? What advice would you give to authors wanting the same path?
I think there's a lot of people that say they want to write a book, they want to write a novel, and they should. The big challenge is the idea. How do you come up with an idea that's either original, if there is such a thing anymore, or can you tell the story in the right way? But what I've learned, I think, is that more important than the idea itself is the story that accompanies the idea. And so you can't just come up with an idea and stop there and start writing. You need to have the right characters doing the right things to make that story come to life. And Teresa, you had indicated that it just hit home for you emotionally, which is, as a writer, I thank you for that. Like, I put words on a page that I think you said at one point made you cry.
Oh, yeah.
That's powerful stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's because the story was there, not the idea. And you have to believe in that story. So my advice, which I think is what the question was, is believe in the story. Even if you're worried about whether you can pull it off. I can't tell you how often, as I continue to write forward, how often I just thought, how am I going to pull this off? And it wasn't just about making Michael believe his definition of cancer. I had to make the reader believe that Michael believed it. And that was a double challenge. And I described it to my copy editor, that this kind of the 2/3 point that I keep referencing. I told her it was like climbing a mountain to thread a needle. I had to do all that work to get to this one spot that I was aiming for, and I had to. It had to land just right. Otherwise, the whole rest of the story, the whole final third, would have failed.
You absolutely did that, because even though when he loses his mom, he's much younger and more naive and not really understanding everything. As he grows and matures and he learns things, he still believes that all of these bad things are cancer that he can outrun or control, or he can stave off any threat to the people that he cares for.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to describe it. He believes he can fend it off. We talked earlier about, he's just got to keep cancer out of him. And that's, there are a lot of themes throughout the book relative to naming conventions, because he refers to cancer as different things to him are cancer. And so I try to instill that in the book itself. Um, you know, there's a metaphor with the garden at one point where you and I might look at a garden and we're trying to grow all these wonderful things in a garden, but weeds might grow and choke out all those things that we're trying to grow. And a botanist might see 20 different kinds of plants we don't want and give them 20 different names. But you and I are just going to call them weeds. And I think Michael does the same thing with cancer. Doctors are going to call all these different kinds of comparable, slow, debilitating diseases by a different name, but to Michael, it's just cancer.
Are you doing any book tours with this?
I've been in a number of Barnes and Nobles and independent bookstores. I continue to try to get more. I hope I find my way to Kentucky someday. But I live in Connecticut and the story takes place in Boston. And so I'm trying to keep my focus there as a local author and a local story. But I think this story could live anywhere.
I'm telling you, this book, I will be surprised if something beats it out for the rest of the year, just for one that correct me.
Yeah, I appreciate all your support.
Is there a place where people can order signed copies of your book?
Signed copies, maybe places where I'm doing a signing. Okay. They can go to my website, Steven M as in Michael, StevenMRubin.com, and they can order the book from there. But to get a signed copy, I don't have a way right now other than to sign one and ship it to them.
Oh, okay. What are your social media handles and where our people can locate you on social media?
Sure, they can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. But I think if they just go to my website, they'll see all the places to click on to get there.
Okay. Thank you to Steve Rubin for joining us today. His book, The Unraveling of Michael Galler, is available wherever books are sold. Look him up on his website for his social medias. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Scott and Teresa, thank you so much for having me on and letting me share my story.
Yes, sir. Thank you.